For 55 years, one of the most notorious unsolved murder cases in American history has resisted every task force, every amateur codebreaker, and every deathbed confession thrown at it. And just when the world assumed the Zodiac Killer's real name would stay buried forever, a new claim landed that pointed investigators in a direction almost nobody expected, connecting California's most infamous serial killer to a completely different unsolved murder from over 2 decades earlier. This isn't the suspect true crime forums have argued about for years. This isn't the school teacher police quietly investigated back in the 70s. This is a name that surfaced through cipher analysis, artificial intelligence-assisted decoding, and old military and social security records. And if the claim holds up, it rewrites the entire timeline of one of the most disturbing chapters in American crime history. Today, we're walking through exactly how the Zodiac case got to this point, why the official suspects everyone has heard of for decades were never enough to close the file, what this newest breakthrough actually claims, and why law enforcement's response to it has been far more complicated than the viral headlines suggest. Stick around until the end, because the detail connecting this case to the Black Dahlia murder is the part that made even seasoned investigators sit up and take notice. Let's rewind to where this all started, because you can't understand why this case has haunted investigators for over half a century, without understanding just how brazen this killer actually was. Between 1968 and 1969, a masked figure terrorized the San Francisco Bay Area, murdering at least 5 confirmed victims in ambush-style attacks on couples parked in secluded areas, though the killer himself claimed in taunting letters to have killed as many as 37 people. A number of investigators have never been able to confirm or fully dismiss. What made this case different from other unsolved murders of that era wasn't just the brutality, it was the killer's obsession with communication. He mailed cryptic letters directly to Bay Area newspapers, signing them with a distinctive crosshair symbol, and he sent along encoded ciphers. Blocks of strange symbols he claimed contained clues to his identity, daring the eye, police, and the public to crack them. He threatened to shoot children off a school bus, he taunted detectives by name in his letters, and then, after a final chilling note in early 1974, he simply vanished from the historical record, leaving behind a case file that has swallowed an estimated 2,500 suspects over the decades without ever producing an arrest. For most of those decades, one name dominated the conversation more than any other: Arthur Lee Allen, a former elementary school teacher and convicted sex offender who lived in Vallejo, California, not far from several of the attack sites. Allen became a person of interest after a friend reported him as suspicious, and over the following years, investigators searched his home, questioned him extensively, and collected circumstantial details that seemed to align uncomfortably well with what little was known about the killer, including his access to the type of watch featuring the Zodiac symbol and his familiarity with the geography where the attacks occurred. Allen was never charged before his death in 1992, and DNA testing conducted on envelope samples in later years reportedly failed to definitively match him, though debate over the reliability and completeness of that testing has never fully gone away. A recent documentary series revisited his case in detail, featuring people who knew him personally and remained convinced police had the right man from the very beginning, arguing that circumstantial evidence, personal testimony, and behavioral patterns painted a picture too consistent to be coincidence, even without a slam-dunk forensic match. But for every person convinced Allen was the killer, there's another researcher who thinks the case against him was built more on suspicion and coincidence than hard, courtroom-ready evidence, and that gap between conviction and proof is exactly why this case has never officially closed. Allen wasn't the only name to dominate headlines either. In 2021, a group calling themselves the Case Breakers, made up of dozens of former law enforcement investigators and journalists, announced they had identified the killer as Gary Francis Post, a man they connected to the murders through photographic analysis, handwriting comparisons, and alleged links to an earlier unsolved killing in Riverside, California. Their announcement generated massive media attention, sweeping across outlets almost overnight, complete with claims of an evidentiary goldmine uncovered at Post's former residence. But within days, the FBI and multiple California police departments pushed back hard, publicly stating that the case remained open and that this group's conclusions did not meet the evidentiary standard needed to officially close a decades-old homicide investigation. That pattern, a bold public claim followed by official pushback, has repeated itself with almost predictable regularity every few years since, and it's exactly the environment the newest claim landed in. Which brings us to the theory currently generating the most serious renewed attention, one that connects the Zodiac case to an entirely different, equally infamous, unsolved murder. In December 2025, an investigative consultant named Alex Baber, co-founder of an organization called Cold Case Consultants of America, announced that he believed the Zodiac Killer and the man responsible for the 1947 murder of Elizabeth Short, the victim known to history as the Black Dahlia, were one and the same person. Baber's claim centers on the Zodiac's Z13 cipher, a short, 13 character-coded message sent in April 1970 that investigators had never definitively cracked. Using a combination of self-taught cryptography knowledge and proprietary artificial intelligence software designed to test decoding patterns at a scale no human could manage manually, Baber says the cipher resolves to the phrase Marvin Merrill. From there, he says his research led him to Social Security and public records showing that Marvin Merrill was an alias used by a man named Marvin Margolis, a former United States Navy sailor who served in the medical corps and who, according to Baber's research, had dated Elizabeth Short in the 1940s before her murder and had actually appeared on the LAPD's original suspect list for that case decades earlier. Baber went further, claiming he backed up the connection between the two cases using a separate Zodiac cipher known as Z32, and he presented his full findings publicly at an event in East Hampton, New York in April 2026, describing his conclusion in blunt, confident terms, stating that he believes it is mathematically impossible for it not to be him. Here's what makes this particular claim stand out from the long parade of Zodiac suspect theories that have come and gone over the decades. And it's also exactly why it deserves a level of scrutiny that a viral headline alone can't provide. Baber didn't just present his findings to the media and walk away. According to his own account and subsequent reporting, he has met with California police departments connected to the original Zodiac investigation on at least 2 separate occasions, and those departments are reportedly reviewing his findings rather than dismissing them outright the way earlier viral claims were dismissed almost immediately. That distinction matters enormously in a case this saturated with amateur theories, because law enforcement engagement, even cautious non-committal engagement, is a meaningfully different response than the swift public rejection the case breakers received back in 2021. At the same time, it's important to be clear about exactly what that means and what it doesn't. Police reviewing a claim is not the same as police confirming a claim, and as of this recording, no law enforcement agency has issued an official statement declaring the Zodiac case solved or naming Marvin Margolis as a confirmed suspect. The case officially remains open, exactly as it has for 55 years. It's worth pausing here to talk honestly about why Zodiac cipher solutions in particular deserve extra scrutiny before anyone accepts them as fact, because this case has a long, complicated history with cryptography claims that turned out to be far less certain than they first appeared. The Zodiac's famous 340-character cipher, sent to the San Francisco Chronicle in 1969, genuinely was cracked, but not until December 2020, over 50 years after it was originally sent, by a team of independent codebreakers working collaboratively across different countries using modern computational tools. That decoded message, while a genuine breakthrough, revealed more of the killer's taunting, boastful mindset, rather than any concrete identifying information. And it took over half a century of failed attempts before anyone got it right. That history matters, because it shows 2 things clearly. First, that these ciphers are genuinely difficult enough that even talented, well-resourced teams working for decades can fail repeatedly before succeeding. And second, that even a correctly solved cipher doesn't automatically hand investigators a name, an address, or a conviction. Cryptography can point toward a lead. It cannot, on its own, replace the kind of physical, forensic, and legally admissible evidence a prosecutor would need to actually close a 55-year-old homicide case. And that gap is exactly where Baber's claim currently sits. A compelling lead under active review rather than a confirmed closed case. If you're finding this breakdown interesting, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep making deep dives into cases like this one. There's also a broader pattern worth understanding here, because the Zodiac case has become something of a magnet for exactly this kind of periodic viral breakthrough claim. And recognizing that pattern helps put any single new announcement into proper context. Since the case went cold, researchers estimate that somewhere between 50 and 100 new suspects get publicly named every single year, a staggering number for a case involving only a handful of confirmed victims. Some of these theories carry genuine circumstantial weight, like the case built around Allen over the decades. Others rely heavily on speculative document research, like theories connecting the killer to Earl Van Best Jr., built primarily on circumstantial evidence, including a composite sketch resemblance rather than direct physical evidence. And some, like the Casebreakers announcement in 2021, generate enormous initial media attention before official law enforcement pushback quietly deflates the claim within days or weeks. Understanding this recurring pattern doesn't mean dismissing every new theory as automatically false. Some of these claims genuinely deserve the renewed attention they're getting. But it does mean approaching each new viral headline with the same question serious investigators ask internally. Does this new claim actually meet a higher evidentiary bar than the dozens that came before it? Or does it simply have better marketing and a more dramatic presentation? To really appreciate why any new suspect theory generates this much attention, it helps to understand just how deeply the Zodiac letters themselves shaped public fear during the actual crime spree. Because this wasn't a quiet background news story back in 1969, it was front-page terror across an entire region. The killer didn't just commit murders and disappear the way most unidentified attackers do. He actively inserted himself into the media cycle, sending letters that demanded to be printed on the front page of Bay Area newspapers under threat of committing further violence if his demands weren't met. Editors and police found themselves in an impossible position, forced to weigh public safety against the very real risk of giving a killer exactly the platform and attention he seemed to crave. This dynamic, a serial killer directly manipulating media coverage in real time, was almost unheard of before the Zodiac case, and it set a template that later cases and later killers would sometimes reference or imitate. It also explains why the psychological profile of this killer has always centered heavily on a need for control and recognition, a detail that any credible suspect theory, including the newest cipher-based claim, ultimately has to account for. Whoever this person turns out to be, the evidence strongly suggests someone who wanted desperately to be seen as clever, someone who treated the entire investigation less like a crime to hide from, and more like a game to be won against the police publicly and repeatedly. That psychological pattern is actually part of what makes the Black Dahlia connection theory so intriguing to researchers who study it closely, because Elizabeth Short's 1947 murder carries some strikingly similar hallmarks, despite happening in a different city and over 2 decades before the first confirmed Zodiac attack. The Black Dahlia case also generated massive media attention, also involved a killer who was never definitively identified, despite an enormous exhaustive police investigation, and also produced a case file swollen with hundreds of suspects over the ensuing decades, remarkably similar to the pattern that would later define the Zodiac investigation. If Baber's connection holds up under further scrutiny, it wouldn't just identify one killer, it would potentially explain a 22-year gap in an offender's history, raising serious questions about what such a person might have been doing, and whether other unsolved cases from that intervening period deserve a fresh look through this same lens. That's precisely the kind of far-reaching implication that makes law enforcement agencies cautious about confirming any connection too quickly. Because officially linking 2 major historical cold cases carries consequences that extend well beyond simply naming a single suspect, potentially reopening lines of inquiry into entirely separate unsolved crimes across multiple decades and multiple jurisdictions. It's also worth understanding a bit about how modern cold case investigators actually approach claims like this one internally, because the process is far less dramatic than true crime television often makes it look. When a private investigator or research team brings forward a new theory, especially one involving cipher decoding or pattern-based software analysis, police departments typically start by checking whether the underlying evidence is independently verifiable using their own existing case files, records that, in the Zodiac investigation, span multiple agencies, span more than 5 decades, and in some cases involve physical evidence that has been tested, retested, and re-examined using forensic techniques that didn't even exist when the murders originally occurred. Investigators look for corroboration that doesn't depend entirely on the original claimant's methodology, meaning they want to see whether independent handwriting analysis, independent genealogical research, or independent physical evidence supports the same conclusion the cipher decoding points toward. This is exactly the stage the Margolis theory currently appears to be sitting at, according to Baber's own public statements about ongoing police meetings, a genuinely serious internal review process rather than either outright dismissal or official confirmation. That middle ground, frustrating as it might be for people wanting a definitive answer right now, is actually where responsible cold case work almost always happens, slowly, methodically, and largely out of public view until investigators are confident enough in a conclusion to attach their institutional credibility to it. There's a reason so many amateur codebreakers and independent researchers have poured entire portions of their lives into this specific case over the past 5 decades, and it goes beyond simple curiosity about a famous unsolved mystery. The Zodiac letters were deliberately designed to invite exactly this kind of obsessive public participation, blending real cryptographic puzzles with taunting commentary clearly aimed at anyone who might try to solve them. That design choice created a strange, enduring partnership between law enforcement and the general public that most cold cases never develop, where amateur cryptographers, retired investigators, true crime researchers, and increasingly sophisticated software tools all continue independently chipping away at the same set of puzzles the original killer left behind, decades after his last confirmed communication. It's part of why this case has produced so many competing suspect theories over the years compared to other unsolved crimes from the same era. The killer essentially built an open invitation for ongoing investigation directly into his own communications. And 55 years later, People are still accepting that invitation, using tools he could never have imagined when he mailed those first taunting letters to Bay Area newspapers in the late 1960s. So where does the Margolis and Black Dahlia connection actually fall on that spectrum of credibility? In its favor, it's one of the few Zodiac theories in recent memory to secure actual confirmed engagement from active law enforcement agencies rather than being dismissed outright within days of going public. And it draws on a combination of cipher analysis, genealogical record research, and cross-referencing between two entirely separate historical murder investigations. A more layered evidentiary approach than a lot of previous single-source theories have offered. Against it, the claim still rests heavily on one investigator's interpretation of ambiguous historical ciphers using proprietary software whose exact methodology has not been independently peer-reviewed or replicated by outside cryptography experts, and linking two separate decades-apart murder cases through circumstantial biographical overlap is exactly the kind of connection that has looked compelling in true crime research before, only to fall apart under closer forensic scrutiny. The honest, responsible answer right now is that this is a serious lead worth watching closely, one credible enough that actual police departments are taking the time to review it rather than dismissing it immediately. But it is not, as of today, a confirmed closed case, and anyone telling you with total certainty that the Zodiac's identity has been definitively proven is getting ahead of what the evidence has actually established so far. What makes this moment in the Zodiac investigation genuinely different from previous viral breakthroughs isn't just the claim itself, it's the tools being used to generate it. Modern cipher analysis increasingly relies on computational pattern recognition capable of testing thousands of potential decoding combinations at a speed and scale no individual human codebreaker could ever manually replicate. The same kind of technological leap that finally cracked the 340-character cipher back in 2020 after 50 years of failed manual attempts. As these tools continue improving, and as more historical records from the 1940s and 1960s get digitized and become searchable in ways they simply weren't a decade ago, it's entirely plausible that genuine breakthroughs in this case are still ahead of us, arriving not through a single dramatic confession or discovery, but through the slow, compounding effect of better technology finally catching up to 55-year-old evidence that has been sitting in archives the entire time, waiting for tools sophisticated enough to properly interpret it. For now, the Zodiac Killer case remains exactly what it has been for over 5 decades. Technically open, genuinely unresolved, and still capable of producing headlines that reshape how the public understands one of America's most disturbing unsolved crime sprees. Whether Marvin Margolis eventually becomes the confirmed answer everyone has been waiting for, or simply the latest name added to a suspect list that already stretches into the thousands, one thing is clear, this case still has the power to surprise people, and the combination of old-fashioned investigative persistence with genuinely new computational tools means the next real breakthrough could come from anywhere, at any time. It's also worth remembering that even a fully confirmed identification at this stage would look very different from a typical modern arrest, since any suspect connected to crimes from the late 1960s and the 1940s would almost certainly be deceased by now, meaning any resolution here would likely take the form of an official statement closing the case for historical and investigative purposes rather than an actual courtroom trial. That doesn't make a confirmed answer any less significant. For the victims' families who have waited over 5 decades for closure, for the investigators who have spent entire careers chasing this case, and for a public that has watched this mystery evolve from local terror into a defining piece of American true crime history, a definitive answer would still matter enormously, even arriving this late. It would mean police finally getting to write a final chapter into a file that has sat open for longer than most of the investigators currently reviewing it have been alive, and it would mean the public finally getting to retire a name, the Zodiac, that has functioned for over half a century as shorthand for the idea that some mysteries simply never get solved. If you want to stay updated as this story develops, and it's very likely to keep developing given the active police review currently underway, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the follow-up. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.